welcome to episode 9 of the Anthrozoology podcast. This episode, we will discuss how non-human animals are represented, or not, in the research ethics approval process. We recently convened a workshop for the Research Ethics Conference hosted by the University of Exeter and funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. Thanks to the important conversations this workshop initiated, we decided to dedicate this podcast to continuing the conversation. I'm Michelle Szydlowski, PhD candidate at the University of Exeter. I research human pachyderm relationships in Nepal.
Hi, I'm Kris. I'm also a PhD researcher from the University of Exeter. My research is concerned with cat-human relationships and social discourses surrounding free-roaming cats.
Hi, my name's Sarah Oxley Heaney. I'm a PhD student at the University of Exeter, and my research is looking at shark-human interactions.
And our fearless leader in creating this conference workshop joins us today. Welcome, Jes Hooper.
Hi, thank you for having me. So yes, I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Exeter, and my research is looking at human interactions with the Asian palm civet. So today we are going to be introducing our workshop, and I thought I'd start just by sharing with you what kind of inspired the thoughts behind it. So as an anthrozoologist who works to understand human-animal relationships, I was really struck by the lack of representation to animals within the university's researchers' ethics review process. Animals seem to be included only when they are being physically interacted with, such as in a research lab, but they were not represented as agents within the research itself. In fact, they didn't seem to be considered as ethnographic agents or research informants at all when the research was observational. So after speaking with other anthrozoologists and realizing that this was an issue that had been encountered by many of us before, we wanted to really problematize the ethics process, but through an anthrozoological lens. So we wanted to be able to understand what ethical issues arise in our own research with animals, whether that's the way we're collecting the research or the way that we are disseminating the results and what that impact has on animals. And then we wanted to try and come up with some solutions to make the ethics research process a little bit more robust and inclusive for our non-human participants. So the way we did this was we created a storyline, which we are going to share with you today. And the storyline brings up certain questions that can and indeed do happen in research in our field. So we're going to show that today. And I just want to make clear that whilst these are issues that we have encountered and have been encountered by other researchers like us, Aadita, our character, and the project itself are fictional.
Aadita's Anthrozoology adventure. Aadita is a PhD student who has received ethics approval from her university to conduct research involving both humans and endangered ravens in a country which is not her own, nor is her university located there. Once she arrives at her field site, Aadita discovers that her human participants are quite reluctant to sign her very official-looking participant forms. Worried about losing their participation, Aadita calls her supervisor and asks for advice. Don't worry, the supervisor says. If you gain verbal informed consent, you will be fine. Aadita realizes that not all her research participants can provide informed consent. What are the ethical issues of not having all participants give consent? Armed with verbal consent from her human participants, Aadita begins her observations of the endangered ravens living amongst the human population. There is a raven family just ahead of her with 2 juveniles, and she pauses to watch. The ravens turn to look at her, and the adults place themselves between her and the chicks. Aadita moves closer to get a better view of the young, when she suddenly realizes that she has not asked the ravens permission to observe their family, has offered them no consent form, nor has she listed them on her ethics paperwork. What could this be? When planning to visit marginalized humans, the ethics process was intense, protecting especially children and other vulnerable populations. Yet Aadita was not asked to refrain from interacting with juveniles of other species, even when the parents appeared to be upset by the process. How are social and intelligent animals not considered participants to be included in the research ethics application process? Should these animal informants be considered as agents in the ethics process? If no, why not? And if so, how so?
Yeah, so this is actually a question that I faced in my research. So my initial ethics application, my initial research, I was planning to document street cats. So basically going out with a camera and a notebook and recording cats that I came across out and about on the street. And so I went into it. So it was important to me that I wasn't sort of interrupting them. So this is something I actually wrote in the ethics application, that I would not approach any cats. If they came to me and sort of rubbed on my leg, that was okay, but I wasn't going to try and initiate an interaction or sort of try and force myself on any cats. It was just sort of passive observation, which I guess is a point where we're going to raise later about sort of this informed consent, because they're not informed, they don't know that they're part of my research study. And that's also true with my case studies with human cat partnerships. It's the humans that give consent, and the cat they're there because their human has agreed. So it is something that I thought about, but I don't think generally the ethics process really sort of thinks about it. I don't know what your all's experiences were.
I had a similar issue in that I work with elephants, and my ethics process involved being asked questions about my own safety around the elephants, and being asked questions about safety in the jungle when I was accompanying elephants. There was never a consideration of asking the elephants for consent, or any question of me not approaching juveniles. I approached a lot of juvenile elephants at the breeding center, or the elephants approached me, and there was never any question of, protecting what I would consider a vulnerable population of juvenile endangered species. So I thought that was troublesome to me.
Yeah, I equally found that when I was first putting my ideas down in order to approach my ethics application form, I was very much approaching it from the perspective of the animal. And then when it came to actually completing the ethics application process, I realized that a lot of what I had been considering as the most kind of ethically problematic interactions between me and the animals I was observing weren't really represented in the process. And instead, I was encouraged to think more about the humans that I would be encountering, which of course is very important, but it did lead me to wonder, well, hang on, how are these animals being represented in this process?
I was reading an interesting article by Hamilton and Taylor called Ethnography. Well, it's a book, Ethnography After Humanism, Power Politics and Method in Multi-Species Research. And one of the things that they argue is that as anthrozoologists, critical animal studies people, however you label yourself, we're very keen on acknowledging the presence of animals in our day-to-day research. But when we write up our research, the animal perspective tends to be written out, left out of the story. And one of their arguments is that when we do that, we become complicit in silencing the voice of the animal. And they ask that as researchers, not only are we cognizant of the animal in our, pardon my use of the word animal here, obviously we're all animals, but just for ease, I'm using that term, that when we do that, we really need to be careful, because rather than being part of the solution, we are in all likelihood part of the problem.
But then does that come back to this fear of anthropomorphism and this fear of speaking up for animals? And is that something that we need to address in the ethics review process? I mean, there are, of course, dangers in anthropomorphism. You wouldn't want to say that chimpanzees are smiling when actually it's a fear grimace. But equally, I think as anthrozoologists, we're coming at it from the perspective of the animal. And many of us have backgrounds in animal behavior science, for example. So we're aware of when an animal is either consenting to be involved in that interaction, and we're aware of what behaviors may indicate that they are not comfortable, like the case of the raven trying to shield its young. But why are those interactions not thought about before we go out and collect the research?
I think particularly when you're dealing with a researcher, like you said, a lot of us have biology backgrounds. But when you're dealing with a researcher who decides to study a species that they are unfamiliar with and doesn't have that understanding of what the animal might see as consenting, then I think you have an even further problem, which means it's even more important that we include that in the ethics process, a consideration of animal consent.
One of the biggest issues, I think, is the anthropocentric view that universities or research institutes have, because until recently, we hadn't come across anybody else discussing this. And then, as you are aware, somebody tweeted in response to our workshop at the Research Ethics Conference, and they had put a paper out, and I think Michelle could talk about that in a minute. But for me, it's yet again, even though we are trying to actually, some of us are perhaps trying to put forward the non-human animal voice in a very difficult landscape where people accuse us of anthropomorphism and are very skeptical of our methodologies, quantitative research being included in that, is that yet again, animals are being used as research tools, and we don't ever seem to get away from using animals. And for sure, the ethics process that we all, four of us, have been through does not consider that the animals might be vulnerable, that harm might come to them, regardless, at the very minimum, regardless of whether they should be considered as agents or they should have informed consent, etc. Just even the ability of our research to bring these animals harm, I'm sure us four will try and avoid that. But in the wider picture of universities not considering it, how much harm is brought to non-human animals and plants, for that matter?
Isn't it all about power? I mean, doesn't the ethics approval process sort of serve to reinforce the power differential between the human doing the research and the subjects of that research? And I think that initially protecting marginalized populations of humans was a way of trying to balance those power differentials. But how do we balance them when we're talking about non-human animals? I think that's
right. And and the use of the word subject as well. And maybe it can be a more subtle approach to this question in the ethics review process. Maybe instead of being able to list out the subjects of our research, we should be able to list animals as the participants of our research, because they are informing our worldview of that particular situation that we're addressing. So maybe we need to look at the language that's at play as well.
For sure, the language at play. I went to a workshop about research ethics from the university, and the language used was humans and animals, not even recognizing that humans are in fact animals. How do you think we can go about approaching particularly our university, perhaps, to try and ask them to, or consider some kind of change in the process?
I think opening up this type of discourse is probably the first step. I think it's really encouraging that when we started this process of putting together a workshop, there was very, very limited research out there. And it's very encouraging to now find that there are authors who are publishing papers exactly on this topic, but it's still very new. So I think having these conversations and, like, you guys inviting me onto the podcast today is a really positive move, because we're bringing this discussion to people that might not have institutional access to the latest research papers. And it's putting it in a format where it's becoming more open to general discussion in the public domain. So I think starting the conversation is where we need to begin.
I think watching our language also, as it were, like Sarah mentioned about using the word subject, or research subjects. And I notice even on our slide, we have them listed as animal informants. We talk about participants. In my paper, I talk about my human, and I have to use the word non-human, sadly, participants. But I don't like, of course, the word non-human. I think most human researchers don't, because it's an exclusive term. It's a non-member. There's us and then there's them. It's part of that language that serves to separate. So I think if in our day-to-day conversations we are using words like participants and informants, and rather than subjects.
I think so. Going back to the idea of informed consent, so I've been sort of using the human as an analogy. If you want to get informed consent and your participants don't speak your language, you'd be expected to get a translator to ensure that they understood and that they were consenting, that they did have informed consent. So sort of going back to the example of how much experience you have with that animal, how much you may know about the behavioral science. So I feel with my feline participants, I can to some degree get informed consent. I sort of know when they're sort of given me consent to touch them. Whereas with ravens, I wouldn't know. And I guess my point is that if I was planning a research project to go and study ravens, I would think about getting on board or collaborating somebody who understood raven body language or had some sort of knowledge of their sort of behaviors, so that they could sort of help me when I was thinking of approaching or maybe getting some more close observational data. And that's something that I think about as an anthrozoologist, but I don't think it's something that necessarily is thought about for non-human participants. But it's absolutely something that ethics reviewers would think about if you were going to go and observe humans without their consent. That would be a no-no, and you'd have to have informed consent. So you'd either take on board a translator if you didn't speak that language yourself. And I think that's something that, we should think more about with our interactions with non-humans, and how much we can honestly say that our participants are giving informed consent, and ensure that we're not invading their privacy, their family, or disturbing them in some way that they're not happy with.
We had an interesting discussion the other day when we were doing the workshop, the difference between where you might be able to have some kind of inclination that an animal has given informed consent because they're not in a captive environment. For example, the sharks that I'm going to hopefully be diving with, whereas, and the cats that you see on the streets as well, Kris, whereas Jes and Michelle are both working with captive animals. So and the other tricky knot in that situation is, whereas Jes and Michelle are trying to give some kind of voice for these animals, they're giving a voice, but possibly without informed consent, but actually trying to assist, whereas others might be doing similar research, but with trying to not speak for the animals. I don't know what you guys think, Michelle and Jes.
Well, as for the consent side of things, I feel like I tried to be very careful about asking consent, because like you said, that the elephants that I worked with were captive elephants who for the most part are kept chained when they're not working. And so out of respect for, very complex, intelligent beings, I approached them, openly and let them sort of make the first move, let them show if they were interested in interacting with me, rather than just, as I've seen other people do, marching right up to them in their bedrooms, essentially, and just doing whatever needs doing. I tried to be very cognizant of my body language and cognizant about reading their body language to see whether or not they were giving me the type of informed consent that I desired. I didn't want to interfere with them and make them uncomfortable. But I don't think that people who are in other situations, say if you're doing biological research, I doubt very seriously that you consider asking your biological research participants for consent.
Yeah, I have a similar situation because the majority of the civets that I'll be working with and the majority of animals that I've researched in the past have been in zoological institutions. So I can minimize my kind of impact on their day-to-day activity as much as possible. So, I can habituate the animals to my presence. My first study, for example, was on binturongs, and I think I was observing them for about 7 or 8 hours of the day for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time. And they're crepuscular, basically nocturnal, so I just watched them sleep, right? So my impact on them was very, very minimal. But there are certainly situations where I could be having more of an impact on those animals. For example, if I was to enter the enclosure with the zookeeper, if I was to do some feeding, if I was to be present for a health examination. These are all interactions that I could have as a researcher in a zoological institution, be it under supervision. But in the ethics review process, it's how are you going to ensure that you're, being safe and not getting bitten, not going to allow the animal to escape because it could be an invasive species. You need to protect the environment. So I've got to protect the environment. I've got to protect myself. I've got to protect the public. I've got to protect the members of staff that I'm working with. I've got to, but I'm not protecting the animal. And that's where my kind of discomfort comes from the ethics review process. And I liked the idea, I think everyone has kind of mentioned already, that they have an understanding of the animal's behavior. And so we can try to gauge some form of consent through animal behavior. But again, we're coming at this through the lens of anthrozoologists. How many people are actually observing interactions that involve animals, but they may not realize it's involving the animals? What if you're doing research of educational capacities of zoos? But to do that, you are entering into a situation where animals are on display or being used in a show. How are you going to make sure that your study isn't going to impact those interactions? Would the ethics review process include the animals that are in that situation with you, even if those animals aren't the focus of your research? And maybe we need to be submitting with the ethics application an ethogram of behaviors. So we can show that we have researched whether an animal is showing us that they are uncomfortable, or they're in pain, or they're distressed. And that we have shown some diligence to try and understand the language that these animals are communicating with us in order to show their intentions and what they want from us.
How would you do that with such animals as ticks, or something that is not necessarily mammalian, or something that, and I think an ethnographic diagram that could make people look at standards which may not then be able to be questioned, and then kind of drive us down a route of saying, okay, the animal acted like that, therefore it does not create harm, when in fact everyone has got its own personality and it's individual. And
I think the biggest problem, I mean, you're definitely correct in bringing up things that, we find it harder to quantify, like invertebrates. It's definitely easier to empathize with mammals because we share so many emotional and physiological characteristics with them. It doesn't mean it's impossible for a start. There's definitely personality and preference testing and things like that they do with reptiles, for example, which don't have the same facial expressions, so they can be harder to read. But I just think there needs to be more attention paid to that. And I'm not saying that there's necessarily the answers right now, but I think we are highlighting a gap in the ethics process that isn't best reflecting what the animal is trying to tell us. I, for example, would not know if an octopus was happy with me being really close to it, or whether it was inquisitive. I can hazard a guess, but like you said, like actually communicating with an expert in that species who can give me more of an idea as to what that animal is trying to communicate, needs to be done before we go into the field.
But aren't we crossing boundaries then between behaviorists who do perhaps consider animals as objects rather than what we're trying to do, which is consider them as ethically significant beings, which might be in a particular body, but might not necessarily have characteristics or traits which we stereotypically give to different species, which is something I really struggle with. We allow humans to be all sorts of people, all have all sorts of a range of characteristics, feelings, emotions, etc. But it's almost as if as soon as we talk about a non-human animal species, we seem to have this mask, this dress, this costume wardrobe, which each one should wear at some point, and it's a very limited spectrum, and that I really struggle with that.
Well, that's one of the reasons that I chose to use a little bit of animal biography in my work, because part of what you're talking about is simple commodification. I mean, commodification depends upon being homogenous, looking at things as a population as opposed to individuals. And once we start to highlight individuality and call individual research participants by their names and associate them with a personality, we're helping to limit that commodification. We're saying we need to look at these individuals as individuals and not simply as members of a population. But I mean, I do think it all goes back, let's roll back past feminist studies and roll back to, colonialism. I mean, isn't it all just kind of a colonial attitude that somehow it's our right to tromp around wherever we want to tromp around, whether we have no experience there or not? And in the past, it was showing up in cultures that were not your own to research those cultures. And now it's showing up with groups of animals. And I think part of the research, part of the ethics process has to be a requirement that you gain some knowledge about the population you are studying. It's no longer ethically correct to go pop down a researcher in the middle of a culture they know nothing about. So it shouldn't be ethically acceptable to plop down a researcher to study a population of animals that they don't understand.
You'd say that, Michelle, is that actually true? People can't go and study cultures unless they have some kind of knowledge?
I think that there is an expectation that in anthropology that you would at least speak the language or understand the culture. I would hope that most universities would not approve a research project in a country that's not your own and send out a totally green researcher who has no idea. I mean, I'm sure it happens, but I would hope in big universities it does not.
Yeah, we have things like language classes, and I had a friend who went to Asia, for example, and in the lead up to her going, she enrolled. In fact, it was requested by the university that she would attend language classes and that she would learn etiquette classes, because she was going to be interviewing people in kind of business contexts. So she needed to know the exact etiquette in those situations to not cause offense. And that could have been really detrimental for this long, ongoing research relationship.
And you're right, though, about the primates, too. I mean, if you misunderstand primate communications or elephant communications and you don't know what you're doing, you could very easily end up severely injured.
I want to ask the question, what is the point of the research ethics application process? I'm trying to find, I mean, for example, I'm looking here now, this particular guide from City University in the UK, provides guidelines for responsible conduct of research, honestly report data, results, methods, procedures, publication status, do not fabricate, falsify, or misrepresent data. However, do you think there's another reason we have to go through the ethics application process, which is beyond?
I think the point of the ethics process, as described by our own supervisors at the university, and you mentioned the doctor who tweeted us after the workshop, Dr. Oliver, also said the whole purpose of the ethics forum is to limit risk for the university. It's not to ensure that researchers have thought about moral issues. It's simply to, as she put it, temper radical research. It's to mitigate the risk to the university and make sure that they're covered. Well, thank you for joining us today. Obviously, we're not done with our discussion about the research ethics process. Please join us in our next podcast where we continue the conversation and see what sort of ideas we can come up with. Thank you.